God's view, effectively. Welcome from a former chapel of the beautiful Villa Schifanoia. You can see effectively a bird's eye view of the whole participants lined up for what promises to be a very fruitful workshop, and this is our introductory session. I'm Giulio Pugliese. I am a co-director of the EU-Asia project together with Ken Endo here, right next to me. Yes, out of God's view. But on behalf of both, let me welcome you to this workshop, and I'll start by effectively framing very briefly the order of discussions today. In many ways, Japan has been at the forefront of dealing with the mix of challenges and opportunities offered by China, Japan's giant neighbor, not just with China's re-emergence to regional, if not global centrality or rather influence in the economic, security and political and even cultural agendas. But Japan has been watching and dealing with China effectively from the very inception of and the very beginning of the Japanese polities 2,000 years ago or so. And so we are going to learn to all effects from our Japanese experts, China experts, Japanese security experts, economic security experts, on how best to understand China, first and foremost, and exchange views on how we understand China and what are our divergent points, and how best to grapple with China and how to bridge perhaps those differences in the different agendas I've just very briefly lined up. And I think that this is not just an academic exercise, but really a policy one, not least because of the baton touch, if you want, between the Japanese presidency of the G7 last year and the Italian presidency of the G7. And we have lined up European, but also Canadian and Japanese, of course, experts and practitioners in this room for that purpose. I would say very briefly that there is growing alignment. This alignment has been favored not just by a convergent set of views on China, which of course still need to be bridged, and we will explore those differences, but also thanks to Japanese leadership, one that has actually worked in combination with the Biden administration, which has actually taken an activist role in bridging its own allies across the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific, and within the region also through minilaterals and ad hoc coalitions, often aimed not just at containing, balancing, or diluting China's presence, but also at providing international public goods. And this is one of the themes that we will touch upon, the importance of winning the so-called Global South, a misnomer for emerging and developing economies, some of which, of course, will be politically more important in the future. Think about India, or think about Indonesia. And so resources are finite, and we need to grapple with the idea of how best to coordinate and to also manage our broadly defined China policy with regards to engagement of these third parties within the G7, perhaps platform as as a starting point. Because that is the minilateral, if you want, that has functioned the fullest in terms of witnessing an alignment and of also operating along the military security, economic security, global South engagement agendas that we are talking about today. And with that in mind, let me give the floor to former ambassador and now scholar in residence at Gakushuin, Ambassador Professor Ishii Masafumi, who embodies many of the topics that I have brought to the fore right now. He was a former Japanese ambassador to Belgium and NATO before Japan had a standalone embassy in Brussels dedicated to NATO. And he was, more recently, at the high point of his career, a very successful Japanese ambassador to Indonesia. And I'm sure that his keynote speech will illuminate many of the points that I've highlighted right now. And so, without further ado, let me welcome with a round of applause Professor Ambassador Ishii Masafumi.
Thank you, Giulio. And I guess this is a former monastery. So I have one confession to make. That is, I'm no expert of anything you mentioned. That's why I'm chosen for the keynote. I mean, keynote can be done by anybody in this room, I think. But I have like a time until 9:45, so 20 minutes. So let me talk about basically three things. First, I want to talk about, oops. Sorry, it's okay. I want to talk about where we are heading to in coming 10 to 20 years. Number two is what Japan and Europe can do together to make what's going to happen in 10 to 20 years better for us. The last but not least, I will take the example of Taiwan contingency, possible Taiwan contingency, to talk about how to deal with what Giulio called the global south. I'm going to talk about global south in a more conceptual way in the third session, but in this keynote speech, I'll talk more about Taiwan specifically. Okay?
We're also sharing with the people online. We have technical problems and...
Okay. It's okay? All right. First, where we are heading to. I think you know this by instinct already, but US perhaps is the only superpower this time, but G3, not G2, is going to emerge in 2030s, I think. US GDP is still 1.5 more than that of Chinese, and defense spending is 2.5 times more than that of Chinese. As you know, the US defense spending takes care of more than 40% of the global defense spending is aggregated. But in 20 years, around 2040 or sometime in 2030s, I think we will see three top-tier countries emerging, and the interaction of these three countries, US, China, and India, will decide the major direction of the international affairs. By sometime in 2030s or 2040s, even in spite of the slowdown of Chinese economy, I think nominally speaking at least, China's GDP will become more or less the same as Americans. It takes more time for Chinese defense spending to become as much as Americans, but it will come sooner or later. And then population-wise, as you know, India is more than that of China last year. And India's GDP will become more than that of Japan, I think next year, as early as next year. Actually, next year, 2025, Japanese GDP will become less than the GDP of all the ASEAN countries aggregated. So there will be a new era. That's first point. So in the title of this conference, we don't see India, but I think we cannot escape of talking about the future of India. I know there are a lot of skepticism about the future of India, but I think we need to keep our eyes on the future of India, because it's good for us. Rather than seeing a direct confrontation and competition between China and China and the United States. If we have India alongside with them, that opens up a lot of more options for us to work on. Second trend I see is Indonesia and India will be decisive for creating majority in the world. I'm not saying this because I was stationed in Indonesia. It's been predicted by many think tanks that Indonesia's GDP will become more than that of Japan sometime in 2040s. 2045 is their 100th-year anniversary of independence. By then, I think their GDP will be world number 4, I think. And Japan, hopefully, will be number 5. So if we try to create new G7 in 2040s, who will be in? I think G3, right? Japan, China, India, and US. Plus Japan and India as number 4 and number 5 of GDP. And Europe, if it stays united. And for that reason, I'm sure Europe has no other option but to stay united. And if it's the 2040s, I wouldn't be surprised too much if the UK will have come back to the European Union. I know it's not that simple, but and last but not least, I'm afraid Russia. I think after Ukraine war, Russia is not going to go away, although completely shattered and weakened, very small GDP, as large as Korea's. It still has a lot of huge number of nuclear weapons, and it has a veto in Security Council, which they will never give up. So I think that Russia is not going to be strong enough to start something very good by itself, but it still has power to stop good things from happening. So, I mean, I hate to sort of work with that kind of country, but it stays. It's a reality. You have to take that into consideration. So if something like Ukraine conflict happens at that time, what's going to happen? It's more or less what has been happening over Ukraine in the past few years, which means on the one side you see US, Japan, and Europe sticking together with a shared view. On the other side, I think you see China and Russia, although their views are not completely the same, comparatively speaking, they are on the other end. So point is, who are left in between? That's, I think, India and Indonesia, which means where these two giant, big countries are closer to our side or to the other side, will decide the global majority. And these two guys are big enough to be able to stay, well, they will never ally with anybody. They will always make their decision based upon their bare national interest. They're big enough to be able to do that. So I think there aren't so many things you can do to keep them closer to us. But there are, if you are determined to do it and if you stay on course, you can still do it. That's what we have to do in the coming few decades. Last point is ASEAN is going to be more divided. I think Southeast Asia becomes the center of competition over influence among G3, US, China, and then I think India. After all, that area is called Indo-China, which means historically that was a place where the influence of India and China collided with each other. But in the past few decades, I think the United States was there, but it's about time for India to come back to use their influence over that area. And they say, as you know, in public, don't force us to choose, because we're never going to make a choice between China and the United States. But what actually is happening is they have already chosen in their heart. You know, the Japanese Foreign Ministry has been doing opinion poll, which is normally no use, but this one is very good. Since 2008, every 2 years, we asked a consistent question, very detailed question, one of which is, which country are you going to rely on more in future? Or which country are you going to trust more in future? And then, after all these ODAs, Japan has supplied a lot of technical cooperation to all ASEAN countries. There are only 3 countries who have been saying that Japan is more important than China. These are Indonesia, Vietnam, and the Philippines, which I call Big 3. Countries with a population of more than 100 million, and they are big enough to be, I mean, in peaceful time, they always deal with everybody to get the best out of everybody. But what I'm talking about is, at the crisis time, are they going to give in to the pressure coming from the north, or are they ready to rely on somebody outside, like China, Japan and the United States, to say no to the pressure coming from the north? And I think these three big guys are able and ready to do that. So I think from that viewpoint, I think simply because they are ready to rely on us, we should do more to them. There are three other categories: medium countries, Thailand, Malaysia, Myanmar. All these countries are very, very important for Japan. Thailand has the heaviest concentration of Japanese industry in Southeast Asia. Malaysia used to adopt the Look East policy. There are a lot of people trained in Japan. Myanmar had that coup d'etat didn't happen. Myanmar was the last frontier for Japanese industry to move in. But the result of that opinion poll swings between Japan and China according to different administrations. Swing is very clear. That's how these medium-sized countries have survived and maintained their independence in the past few thousand years, I think. So although these countries are very important, we should know that these countries will not be with us all the time. Small three, Cambodia, Laos, Republic, Brunei, where result always goes with China, which you need to, they have no other choice. Cambodia is big, very important, we are ready to help them. Brunei, important, we import a lot of natural resources from them still. But you need to control your expectation as to what they are ready to do at the time of crisis for us. Last category, Singapore, this is a special exception. If you ask that question to the people on the street, 95% of them say that, of course, China is going to be more important for them. In recent years, they have accepted a lot of immigrations from mainland China in order to maintain the ethnic balance, right? But if you look around, they've been hosting US Navy and the Air Force since the beginning of 1990, right after US decided to leave the Philippines. Actually, it was Singaporean government who knocked the door of the United States, saying that we can do it if you have already left the Philippines. So why don't you let us do it? So that's how they sold the value of their own country. And they've been doing this since then, 1990s. They have just extended 10-year contract. So I do hope they will continue to do this even after things like Taiwan contingency happens. Now, that has done the trend. So what does this mean to Japan? As Julio was trying to say, Japan's fundamental objective and choice of the foreign policy in the past 2,000 years is to coexist with China because you cannot change neighbors. In the past 2,000 years, most of the time, China was bigger, more advanced, stronger than Japan. So fighting war with them was out of the option. And instead, we wanted to make the best of the opportunity China presents us. But bottom line is we don't want to be told what to do. Nobody wants to be told what to do. So our task is to maintain the position where we could say no when it comes to a crucial issue for Japan, and that even if China express antipathy against it, we can still go ahead. So how can we do that? And it just so happens that since the end of the Second World War, we've been doing this by allying with the strongest and most trustworthy country. Most trustworthy means we don't trust the United States 100%. Nobody does. Huh? Europe don't, of course. But relatively speaking, I mean, they are more trustworthy than China. They are more trustworthy than Russia. So I think it's been, and after all, they have been the biggest GDP since the end of the Second World War. So I think that's why we decided to rely on the United States. That's why US is now the alliance partner for Japan. And with the trends I've just explained in the coming 20 years in mind, should we change this fundamental choice? I don't think so. US is no longer the only superpower in the coming 20 years, but it will stay as the strongest among G3 at least. So it makes sense for us to continue our alliance with the United States to face with China so that we will not be told what to do. But the point is, U.S. Relative supremacy is in a serious decline, and I'm going to talk about in the later session, but U.S. readiness or will to engage in international affairs has been weakened dramatically and faster than we think. So that's why we cannot act like business as usual. Japan needs to do many more things in order to maintain overall deterrence level. So this is what is behind 3 strategic documents in December 22. And it's not written in that way, but it's more or less taken for granted. And, but one point is we may have to revisit this question of after 2050. I think if the present trend continues, I think US will be perhaps the strongest, and we should maintain the Japan-US security alliance up to 2050. But beyond that, I don't know. I guess the alliance may not be enough to deter China. Right. So what can we do together to deal with the situation? So both of us need to become stronger. I think Japan is going to increase defense spending up to 2% by 2027, and we're going to achieve seamless defense, including cyber and space, where we have a lot to cooperate with NATO. Second is we need to make Japan-US security alliance more closely coordinated, and close coordination with NATO as well, right? 10 more minutes, yeah? Okay. I'll stop wherever necessary, I think. And so we need to promote serious planning efforts, particularly over, we have done serious planning over Korean Peninsula, but to be frank, we haven't done that over Taiwan yet. I think even the United States have not done that with Taiwan yet either. No wonder we haven't done it with the United States. So, but it's about time to start. And we need to establish more practical C2 command and control with Japan, with the United States. But more importantly, these two may not be enough. We need to expand the base of security cooperation by strengthening networks among like-minded countries, where I think Europe can make a lot of contributions. I mean, for us, the core partnership is Quad, Japan, US, India, and Australia. And we will take every opportunity to expand it. But I think China has succeeded in painting Quad as an anti-Chinese organization. So I think countries in Southeast Asia, even those countries, those big guys like Indonesia, will never join, I think, Quad, because that means making obvious choice to go for the United States instead of China. For the same reason, I think Indonesia decided not to join BRICS, because BRICS has become a fairly anti-American organization in the eyes of Indonesia. That's why Indonesia decided to say no to the membership of BRICS. So, who else? I think Korea, ROK. I think to become a member of Quad, you need to be ready to join Quad, even though you are seen doing something anti-Chinese. But secondly, you should be able to make a meaningful contribution. Quad is a little bit more than the talking shop. It does security cooperation with regional countries. So those countries who are willing, there aren't so many countries who are willing to join as well as able to make cooperation. So you need to clear these two hurdles, and I think ROK is perhaps among the few. And of course, if UK wants to become global, I mean, you are always welcome. So UK may join Quad as well. But I think we will try to expand the Quad, because this is the most important base for multilateral coordination. And the strengthened cooperation with Southeast Asia, if I have time, I'll talk about it later. And also to follow up new strategic concept of NATO, specify what we can do with Europe. I think there has been an action plan adopted, and, but there are many things we can do. And I think we had a joint exercise with Germany and Netherlands and Japan, US, France, UK, and in China Sea, which got the huge attention of China. I think when they come to us with very noisy complaints, we think we made a big success. So at that time, their complaints were so huge that we know that we did a good thing. And you know, the important thing which I'm going to talk about later is that in order to deter China from invading into Taiwan, I think reality, perception matters more than reality. In other words, what Europe is actually going to do at the time of crisis is less important than the perception that European Union can create for China to take into consideration. So if they see occasional visit of European naval ships, be it the French or be it the UK, they have to take into consideration that at least a possibility that they will get involved at the time of crisis. Although we know that you know, you are busy with doing something else. So I don't think at the time of crisis you have a physical capability or psychological readiness to get involved, I'm sure. So we are ready to control our expectations, but China cannot take that kind of risk. So that's why I think the occasional, even though it's occasional, I think participation or showing up of the European asset in the region is very, very important from our viewpoint. Strengthen deterrence by becoming best prepared. As I said, planning is very important. We're going to do a serious planning over Taiwan contingency. And I think we have a better chance to deter China from invasion than Russia into Ukraine. I'll explain it later in the stage. Think about with regard to future of Korean Peninsula. You know, the North Korea decided to call South Korea the most important enemy. They are no longer seeking for the unification. And I think the rule of the game at this time on Korean Peninsula is pure deterrence, which means I think there is, theoretically at least, even a greater chance of the unification in the future through the collapse of North Korea. I think I've been believing collapse since 1940s. I made a huge mistakes, but I think this is a time when at least relatively speaking, the possibility of collapse of North Korea becomes higher. Yes, they are shooting a lot of missiles. This morning they shot 3 missiles, but they are just doing this to raise the stakes so that they can start with the hope that they can start some dialogue with Trump 2.0, I think. And well, we need to do something to make the expansion of a nuclear arsenal by China more politically, at least more costly. And there are many things we can do. And but last but not least, with all these efforts behind us, I think we need to talk to China. I think maintain and strengthen, if possible, strategic communication is a key, especially to deter China from Taiwan invasion. And it's crucial that the risk of failure is clearly understood by Chinese Communist Party, particularly Xi Jinping himself. Because you know the communist total authoritarian regime is very strong, but their shortcoming is that their leadership doesn't have any political legitimacy, where we do through election in a liberal democracy. So instead of that kind of legitimacy, what Xi Jinping has been doing is to make sure that tomorrow is better than today for the people, Chinese people. And then it's been relatively easy in the past few decades, but after the double-digit growth for more than 10 years, there aren't so many things left as a source of legitimacy. And I think reunification in the wording of Taiwan is the strongest and the ultimate source of legitimacy for Chinese Communist Party. So bad news is that they can never give it up. They can never give up the use of force when necessary. But good news is if they fail, that may lead to the collapse of that can lead to the collapse of the Chinese Communist Party. So what we have to do is not the thing the United States did in Baghdad, just with a huge number of force in a few days. We don't have to do that. What we need to do is to show China that, of course you can do it. I mean, of course you can start doing it, but you may fail. There is this chance of failure. If we succeed in showing them the risk of failure, that should be good enough for us to stop Chinese Communist Party to do it. So that's, we can do it through expanding our military forces, increasing our readiness, but if they don't understand it, what's the point? So the crucial jigsaw puzzle, piece of jigsaw is to let Xi Jinping himself understand that there is actually a serious risk of failure. So I think that's why every country in the world is struggling with finding who can deliver the best message, who has the most time of Xi Jinping. So I think Japan is yet to find that kind of a channel. Oops. Oh, sorry. Oh, I can skip this. 2 minutes. Oh, 2 minutes, okay. I think I've talked about this already. Case study, Taiwan contingency. I don't think I have enough time to do this, but this relates to my explanation about Global South in the second session, but I think where we means liberal democracy has advantage over China and Russia is if we try hard, we can make many meaningful, powerful friends. If the United States is willing to do it, they can still gain many friends, more than that of China and Russia can make. I mean, do you want to become friends with North Korea and Iran? I think these are the countries they can make friends with, but we can do a much better job than that. So our task should focus on making more friends. And so for that purpose, there are many things we should do, which I'm going to explain later, but at least among allies and like-minded countries, like Europeans and Japanese, we need to share the viewpoint about who are our priority partners, who we should prioritize our relation with. That's very, very important. And what we need from each one of them. And third is what we should do now to achieve that end. So if you apply these three things to all these Southeast Asian countries, the answer is quite clear about what we should do with them to be more ready or to give a impression that to China that they may get involved. I don't think I have time to go into that, but I think applying these three things, and also we can do a division of labor and coordination among Japan, Europe, and United States, which can be the best place to do it is, I'm sure, G7. Yeah? G7, you need to talk about these things. Who are priority partners? Should we make India and Indonesia as a permanent guests? Things like that. And what do we need from them? I think from India, the best case scenario is if India starts going to the north after China decided to invade into Taiwan. That would be our best case scenario. India going to the north means India-China border. So, of course, I'm half serious actually, and of course it's up to India. It's India's decision at the time of crisis. They will make a decision based upon their national interest at that time. But perception-wise, what if we start doing a lot more army exercises with Indian armies, more frequent, and with many different countries? I think Japan has started doing it. Last year we did twice. United States decided to do it. If you do these things, make efforts to strengthen Indian army, if you were Chinese, I'm sure they would understand why we are doing it. So that's how you do it. That's what I said, reality, perception is more than reality. Indonesia, I think it's crucial to gain their support for keeping alternative sea lanes of communication open. And let me just give you the final, sorry, it stopped moving. No, a few more. We have yeah, this is it. This shows the sea land communication. Green line shows the present one, going through Malacca Strait and going up Bashi Channel in the south of Taiwan and then coming to Japan. If Bashi Channel, Taiwan Straits, and the Malacca Straits are all closed, I think the only alternative sea land communication which is both economically viable and physically possible is the blue line. That goes the south of Indonesia, go up in the center of Indonesia through Lombok, Makassar Strait, going through the Celebes Sea, and then going up to the north. And this distance-wise, it's only 10% up. The green line is 6,500 nautical miles, blue line 7,500 nautical miles. So, and it's physically possible. I mean, many ships are already using this line, blue line. So our task is to make Indonesia strong enough to be able to keep these sea land communications safe and open. Of course, they cannot do it by themselves. We need to help them, but it's a big, proud country, so we cannot tell them that, oh, this is very important. I know you cannot do it, let us do it. You simply cannot say that. You just tell them that, you know, this is how we see the things. I know you understand that this is your international responsibility, so please do it. If you need any help, just call this number up. So that's how we should do it. So these are the things we need to do at the peaceful time to be more ready and to be able to give impression to China that we are doing everything possible to bring them on board at the time of crisis. Sorry, I'm sorry. I know I spoke too long, but this is the end of my speech.
Fantastic. I'm very sorry. Yes, please remember to press the red button. So no, we are just going to shift our schedule by 5 to 10 minutes. It's not going to disrupt at all the workshop. And seamlessly we'll transition to the next panel. No, you can stay there, and I'll just introduce Dr. Aurelio Incisa, who is a Jean Monnet Fellow in the EUI, as working at the EU Asia project, and also a senior fellow at YAI, and who is a China/Taiwan expert. So Aurelio, the floor is yours. And if you could pass the pointer to Kawashima Sensei, because I think that he will have to use slides, and I'll plug them in.
Thank you, Giulio. Good morning, everyone, and it's my pleasure to chair this first public session for this event, and I'll be very brief. In this first public session, we'll answer to a series of absolutely crucial questions when we look at the Indo-Pacific. What kind of power is China? Does it have imperialistic ambitions, and does it seek hegemony? How different is it from Russia? How does Europe's view of China differ from Japan's? And finally, what are the views on China among European G7 members, including the European Union? And we have three excellent speakers today for this panel. Professor Kawashima Shin, who is affiliated with the Department of Advanced Social and International Studies at Todai, University of Tokyo. Professor Matteo Dian, the professor at the Faculty of Political Science at the University of Bologna. And finally, Ms. Alice Politi, who is finishing her PhD at the Lao China Institute of King's College London and is also a research fellow at the NATO Defense College in Rome. So without further ado, I think we could start with Professor Kawashima.
Thank you so much, Julian and Endo-san. So thank you so much for me to be invited here. Yes. It's okay. Yeah. Yes. Organizer gives me the topics, the questions about China. So, yeah, what kind of power is China? Do it have imperialistic ambitions, and does it seek hegemony? There's so many interests, but a big, huge question. So, in this session, I'll talk about this topic, considering China's empireness, shifting boundaries, okay, for 15 minutes. So, that's my challenge. Yes, at first I talk about Chinese, strategy, Chinese concept of foreign policy at first. And secondly, I talk about my question about the Chinese empireness. First of all, yes, this is Xi Jinping said in 19th Paris Congress of 2017. Yes, for Chinese point of view, the goal is 2049. Yeah, 2049 at that time, China realized their own dream, okay, and China catch up USA. This is their, long path toward the, their dream to be realized. And 2035 is the midway point, okay. And also the Xi Jinping said, U.S.-China relation will be a competition, okay, and with the U.S. Until 2049. As non-confrontation, but China and the U.S. will cooperate at some field and something. And also, for Chinese point of view, what is the axis in the world? It's not advanced country and Russia and China. For Chinese point of view, axis point is advanced country and non-advanced countries. For Chinese point of view, China is the leader of the developing country. This is China's point of view. And also, Russia is one of the most important partner for China. However, Russia is not ally of China. Because China has a principle, for Chinese point of view, okay? Because China has one principle of foreign policy, just an independent principle that was adopted in the 1980s. So, however, on the point, in terms of the long-term competition with USA, Russia is the most important partner, for China to be against USA. However, if Russia is criticized by most of developing countries, China cannot support Russia. Because China imagines China is the leader of a developing country. This is the case of the Ukraine war. So China supports Putin so strongly. However, China cannot say China supports Russia at the war of Ukraine. This is so clear. And for the Chinese point of view, what a disaster on Russia. If Russia is Putin, administration will be, destroyed and hit by the Russian people. And if Russia will change to be a NATO country, it's a disaster for China. So China has to keep the Russia so strongly. And these are the principle of the Chinese foreign policy, as you know, new international relations and the community with the shared future humanity, and also the major country diplomacy, and other, the China, Xi Jinping has announced that they thought on the foreign affairs, and he announced 10 points and so on. And, China has its own so specific, concept about hegemony. China claims not to be a hegemonic nation. China values sovereignty and independence. Okay, it means China is a developing country, and China has no allies. Okay, that shows China, yes, is criticizing the Cold War thinking, and China claimed itself to be a peaceful and status quo state. This is the content of the propaganda toward domestic society in China. Okay, most of Chinese will believe in this is what China is. Okay, and self-defined as an order maker, especially after Xi Jinping administration. This is a changing point between Hu Jintao and Xi Jinping. And Xi Jinping himself said that China will never be the hegemonic expansionist, as his speech at the UN. And Xi Jinping said, if China hegemonizes, it's the road to death. Xi Jinping said, okay? It's interesting. And however, we know what Xi Jinping said, but why do we feel empire-ness or imperialistic, yes, a atmosphere from China? This is my hypothesis. The fundamental problem may be because the boundaries of both space and the people are not setting in stone with some expansionness. It's shifting and moving. Yes, I here point out some elements. The first is history created by Xi Jinping administration in this 5 or 10 years. As you know, Xi Jinping's history policy is so interesting. For Xi Jinping administration takes importance of party, history of party, CCP, it's a priority put on the history of party more than the history of the nation. So the contents of teaching at university or from the elementary school to the high school has drastically changed in these 10 years. And also, it's the new project of China, Xi Jinping administration, positioning the Qing dynasty as a period of Chinese unification. Okay, at the CASS, a Chinese Association for Social Sciences, the Xing Guangcheng, he is the director of the Institute Frontier Studies, 边疆研究所 in Chinese. And this project, led by, yes, Mr. Dr. Xing, but the CAS itself supported so strongly. And they published 2 books last year, and Qing Dynasty, Inheritance and Development and the Traditional Chinese Idea of Great Unity, the Expansion of its Territory and its Transformation into a Sovereign State in Qing Dynasty, okay? The modeling of its subject and the integration of Chinese culture are not extraordinarily significant to the foundation of development of Chinese as a multi-ethnic state and to the formation and development of the Chinese nation. This is the result or conclusion of the books. And also, under the Hu Jintao period, the much more bigger project of Qing Dynasty was studied. The National Qing History Compilation Committee, they advanced the big project. However, this national project is influenced by the new project by a CAS so strongly. Do you know the new Qing history led by the so-called, for example, Mark Elliott at Harvard University? As you know, Qing dynasty is a Manchurian dynasty. So Mark Elliott, he is so positive to use the Manchurian documents. And he strengthened the importance of the elements of Manchurian people. However, Xi Jinping administration criticized him so strongly. So he cannot enter China now. Okay, it's a big problem. And this map. The left map was made in the Mingguo era. The origin between, this is the so clear original China and China at present. Right map is made by the PRC China, the territory, I don't know, traditional Bantu in China, in the Qing dynasty and China at present. There is a big gap, large gap between the original one and the territory at present. So most of the Chinese imagine, the territory at the present is different from the yes, original China. Yeah, excellent. Modification of laws. Next is I said about history. Next one is the law, principle, and logic. Amendment of laws, enactment of laws and the territory water. Do you know? In 1992, China suddenly enacted the law and the PLC, of the PLC and the territorial sea and the continuous zones. At that time, the Japanese government did not criticize so strongly. Secondly, I don't know, in 2002, China, yes, put aside of the so-called the territorial problem of the South China Sea. So China agreed it so-called the DOC with ASEAN countries at that time. However, after 10 years later, China changed its policy. And China sometimes change their principle. For example, so-called intervention theory. China strengthened the importance of the intervention theory. However, China changed it in these 10 years. China now calls it constructive intervention. Constructive intervention. China, yes, said China can send PLA toward other countries. If foreign country requests China, and international organization like UN also requests China, and China can do. There are three conditions. China can send PLA towards other countries like Mali, Djibouti, and South Sudan. And so when the Afghanistan situation was changed, USA withdraws from the Afghanistan, Chinese diplomats and scholars talk about this. Constructive intervention. How does Chinese use it? So this is so interesting. So we have to check the such a shifting of principle, shifting of laws and so on. Next one. How does China change the status quo by force, for our point of view? China says China has never changed the status quo by force. Okay? This is their propaganda. Okay? How about Senkaku Taoi Islands? December 8th, 2008, it was the first time for Chinese vessels to enter the territorial water of Senkaku Islands. Is it China's disturbing? No. Anyway, so that before that point, China's ship has never entered the territorial water of Senkaku Island. So that was the changing point. Okay, not by force anyway, by China. And September 7th, 2010, the Chinese fishing boat collided with Japanese Coast Guard ship vessel. On September 11th, 2012, Japanese government changed the possession rights from private to the national. However, in China, Chinese government does not point out the first, the incident of 2008. China doesn't say in domestic society. China only says 2 and 3. So Chinese people do not know the fact of the number 1. So, and also China strengthened that Japan changed status quo. Not by force, but anyway, yeah. So China criticized Japan so strongly and changed the number of the vessels to enter the territorial water and connecting water. Suddenly the red border increased, right? This is the September 2011. So China uses the accident, okay, and change the situation. And China enhanced the level of the patrol and military activities in that region. This is China's way. Interesting. So recently, around Jinmen Islands, Quemoy Islands, happened some accidents. So China has already changed the schedule of patrol of Chinese Coast Guard and others. China also utilized these accidents to change their activities. And settle Chinese overview. However, we know, China is facing with so many problems. China is compelled to change their own principle. For example, under the BRI, China is suspected. You really advance a win-win policy? Only China gets interests. So China announced one new principle, upholding justice while pursuing shared interests. We also share the interest to you. This is win-win. And the second, global south. As Ambassador Ishii said, in 2023, India held the Global South Summit, but China was not invited by India. It's a big problem. And also China does not like the concept of the Global South. So China did not use the word Global South. However, most of the developed countries use the word South, Global South. So China suddenly changed the policy and started using this word on last July. And also Chinese Foreign Ministry, Chinese Foreign Affairs, the spokesman of the Chinese Foreign Affairs announced the definition, their definition of Global South, that Global South is the group of developing countries, including China. So she said, it is natural, China is a member of Global South. So interesting. So China is adjusting so many constant policies. Yeah, and also I talk about such a people, element of people. Okay, overseas Chinese, yes, Chinese nationals living abroad, and the Chinese national who gets the nationalities of our foreign countries. And for Chinese point of view, they are Chinese. Okay, so China sometimes wants to manage the so-called Chinese in the world. And also extraterritorial application of the law. One Hong Kong student in Japan, she sent some message about Hong Kong situation at the SNS in Japan. But when she back to the Hong Kong, she was detained at the airport. Okay, because of she said something in Japan. Yeah, so many things, but a national security program and China's people in the world, in the other countries, and also China's control the foreigners in China, and also China want to manage the Chinese who meet with foreigners frequently, like the diplomats in China. That was because it's called a wolf diplomats emergence in China and so on. Anyway, in this presentation I talk about the considering the Chinese empire as shifting border from the space and the elements of space and people. I stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Kawashima-sensei. And we continue now with Professor Matteo Dian. Sorry.
Sorry. Thank you very much. Thank you, Giulio and Ken and Aurelio, for inviting me to this workshop. It's a pleasure to be here presenting what is something in between my current research and things that I've done before. So the idea is try to connect, and there will be some overlap with what Professor Kawashima said before, so I'll try to make it complementary, but the idea is trying to reflect on current Chinese takes on the international order, particularly looking at the security realm. So this idea of the title, Making the World Safe for Democracy, is really reflecting the effort on the Chinese side to, in a way, working within some of the boundaries of the current international order, but contesting some of the key strategic and normative pillars of the present liberal international order, especially the liberal part, which is the object of contestation. And so there is an effort to allow much more political space for diversity in terms of ideology, and there is a big elaboration that is often, I mean, it's not missed by scholars, of course, but in the public discourse, especially in Europe, I feel is often missed. So it is important, I think, to underline this aspect. What I would say is that there is a mix of old and new concepts and old and new principles in the Chinese narrative and in Chinese perspective on the international order. And they've been recently re-elaborated, and especially with the new initiatives, the Global Security Initiative, the Global Development Initiative, and the Global Civilization Initiative, being the new sort of programs launched, new initiatives launched by the Chinese government. So there is a sort of ideological oversupply, as we will see. And again, very often we tend to overlook, especially in Europe, the ideological dimension of the Chinese challenge. But I think it is important to look at that aspect as well, especially when it comes not really to our perspective on our relations with China, but thinking how China competes with the West for influence, especially in the global South. So many of the things that I will say in this presentation will maybe sound awkward for a European perspective, but they do matter, especially when it comes to gaining influence and legitimacy, especially in the global South. A small caveat, this is a research and a presentation that builds on theoretical concepts, most of them associated with English School of IR. I will not go into any theory here, but there is sort of a background associated to all this. So one of the premises that, in a sense, legitimacy matter and narratives matter, and the idea of how you present a great power and legitimacy of its actions, it is important. So in theory, a lot of this ideological elaboration is based on a weird mix, a mix of three traditions that in theory should not live together side by side, and they stand side by side in a very awkward way. So these traditions are Marxism, Leninism. In the contemporary iteration, I will say honestly, much more Leninism. So here, more than class struggle, is of course the idea of the parties should lead the modernization of the country, should have the monopoly of power, should organize the society. Then there is the post-colonial nationalism, so the rhetoric of the 100 years of humiliation, and a strong take against a perception of the West that it might be ready to derail the Chinese rise. So all the emphasis that the Chinese government puts on patriotic education and all these elements that I think everyone in this room is familiar with. So the idea of emphasizing an external threat and necessity for the country to be saved, the country to be strong against real and alleged enemies. The other interesting element that has been building in the last, I would say, maybe 20 years, but especially 10 years, is the Neo-Confucian element. So this idea that China's return to the center of the international order brings stability, harmony, respect of differences, and can, especially the idea that was mentioned also before, that China can reach back to its own history, considering history a sign and a resource for strength, while in the previous years was considered a problem because China was weak, and therefore the idea was building something new. Now there is an entire revaluation of what they call 5,000 years of history, which of course is a myth, since there's no 5,000 years of continuous history under same polities, but again is a useful way to reinterpret and manipulate history. If you have time to sometimes look at something very, very weird, there is also a propaganda movie called When Marx Meets Confucius, which is a very, very awkward encounter between the two, in which they all say that what China needs is definitely not Western-style democracy, and therefore China can adapt Marxism and to its own special characteristics, largely rooted in the Confucian tradition. Again, this is not just propaganda, but it is a sign of an effort to find a solution that is definitely not liberal democracy. And this is, I think, is the side that makes it interesting on our side and makes it a challenge, especially when it comes to gaining legitimacy towards the global South, but also internally. So in all this, what it emerges especially from the three initiatives together, is a revaluation of China's great power role. So all these concepts, the community of common destiny, the idea that the world needs the Chinese wisdom and history, something that was not present before, it is very important. It is a claim to leadership. It is a claim to power, in a certain extent. It's an idea of carving up a role of great power, of legitimate great power for China. All these documents, especially when it comes to the GSI, are targeting US-led alliances. NATO, US, Japan especially, but the other alliances as well. We will see in a second how. But there is a strong idea that the world that China wants is a world without US-led alliances. So this is partly ideological, but of course then reflects into more practical policies later on. The other element is a super strong emphasis on sovereignty and self-determination that very often is not perceived as what it is, but what it is a way to say we don't want to accept that becoming modern and capitalist in a certain extent means evolving in a way in which we have to respect human rights and liberal freedoms. So it's really a way to find an alternative away from liberalism, something that China's been saying much more explicitly lately. It's always been there, but now it becomes an offer to the rest of the world. It becomes a model to imitate for others, something that was not before. Before was the special features of China. Now it becomes a recipe, an alternative recipe for the world, especially in the global south. And this is a serious challenge for the West in general, or for those that support liberal ideas, me included. So the other important point is the take on multilateralism, is considering central the United Nations and considering this a way to work in the system, to gain legitimacy, to find out space diplomatically, and of course other initiatives based on centrality of China, but especially the UN. And this is something that EU, United States should be taking seriously. So that perhaps should go together with our emphasis on minilaterals and alliances, returning to think that UN have to be and need to be a central stage for competition and cooperation. So one of the important, perhaps the most important, the Global Security Initiative, here I will just stress a couple of things. One, of course, we found all over the place respect to sovereignty and territorial integrity. It was kind of a given, but fine. But also, we know that China has taken a certain position on Russia's war against Ukraine, for instance. So yes, okay, there is respect of sovereignty, territorial integrity, but there are exceptions, or there are at least tensions, especially when it comes to this idea of a common, comprehensive, cooperative, sustainable security, an indivisible security. There is a rejection quite explicitly of US-led alliances. So if the United States expand their alliances, therefore we have to do something, and we kind of morally and politically justify what Russia has done, because perhaps we can do it as well in the Indo-Pacific one day. And the point 4, which is taking seriously legitimate security concern of all countries. This is a way to justify Russia's invasion. This is a way to open up the idea of saying, well, the United States have expanded their alliances in the Indo-Pacific, and therefore we are authorized to, because it's not our fault. This is what really means. And also, this is a way to say, normally we reject spheres of influence, but here we open the door to spheres of influence, because how do you translate this? That Russia can have a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, so we can have a sphere of influence in Asia. So this is a very important sign to be taken seriously. Again, what I've said before, a lot of emphasis on sovereignty that translates into, and this is central to the Global Civilization Initiative. What does it mean? It's not just departments of humanities talking to each other. It's much more the idea that, well, from the Roman Empire has emerged something which is liberal democracy. From the Qing Empire emerges something which is socialism, Chinese characteristics. From other civilizations and other traditions can emerge something else. But this is the philosophical antithesis to saying everything will lead to recognition of the centrality of human rights. So this is an anti-liberal story. To say we can end up in a different modernity, which is not the Western modernity, is something based on the state much more than individual, for instance. So it ends up on the relativism on human rights, but also ends up in a much more practical take on, for instance, R2P, humanitarian protection. Of course, there is explicit rejection of Pillar 3, so humanitarian intervention, something that led to Libya and was leading to Syria. But this goes further, because China had agreed on the early steps of R2P before Libya. And so it was a bit defensive in that sense, because it was trying to find a compromise between being a responsible great power and being a power that supports a vision of the order rooted on sovereignty. But now that compromise is past. There's much stronger advocacy towards a world that doesn't accept those principles that are inherently liberal. Giulio, can you push the next slide? So again, here it's important to see the possible tensions within this vision, particularly between China's great power role and non-intervention, something that came out already before and will come out in how China approaches Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Mentioned the spheres of influence, which is something that de facto is emerging as a concept. But again, this concept of common cooperative security, that is very common. It comes from Russia, essentially. It's not inherently Chinese. It's something that Russia and China have very much in common. It has a Cold War legacy. So it is another way to see the order, to try to undermine the legitimacy of alliances and their expansion, including the unilateral agreements. Giulio, can you move the next? Okay. Oh, sorry. So as anticipated very briefly, so in the 12 points, this was already all present. China trying to cast itself as a mediator, then accusing the West of Cold War mentality, and de facto opening the way to a concept of legitimate security interest that means admitting spheres of influence, essentially. So this is already a very important example of potential applications of these concepts. Finally, I want to conclude very briefly with differences within the G7 countries, especially between the European side, I would say, and Japan. Where clearly Japan saw this coming well before than we do, and saw the ideological nature of the challenge in terms of different takes on the international order. I think that the engagement we had with China kind of assumed that these differences did not matter. And we woke up to this reality just in the few recent years. But also many policymakers in Europe will go on and saying that China will not work according to a different ideological perspective on the international order. So this is a big difference. Of course, Japan worked out much before the idea of competing while coexisting. That is the key idea, finding a good combination. But also with the free and open Indo-Pacific, managed to root its own understanding of the regional and international order on values plus strategic priorities, since we don't have a FOIP without a strong take of what it means being a great power and a democracy at the same time. So FOIP is all constructed around the concept that are democracies that maintain the liberal international order. So the counterpoint was already there in the free and open Indo-Pacific. And also on this side of the world in Europe, and I close with this, many more things matter. And as anticipated before, Russia, our own relationship with the United States, domestic policy intertwined with our own relationship with the United States, sometimes more than how we see strategically and ideologically China. And I will conclude with this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matteo. Perfectly on time. Thank you. And now we continue with the last speaker of this panel, Ms. Alice Politi. Please, Alice.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. Thank you, Matteo and Professor Kawashima-Shin. So, in terms of like what kind of power China is and whether it has imperialistic or expansioning ambitions, China's rise or re-emergence, as so-called rise or re-emergence, has been certainly welcomed with a certain degrees of concerns over its global vision and aspirations by the United States, but also its like-minded partners. And this is certainly because China has never had such a large strategic space where potentially exercise its influence. And as Professor Dian was mentioning, like Europe sort of woke up just in recent years, understanding this. So I wouldn't say that China behaves though as a traditional hegemonic actor. This is because often, despite a lot of the Western literature detecting this behavior and conceptualizing this as sort of like threat and concern over security matters, however, when investigating the simple question of what exactly is the nature of Chinese power, and how this is exercised strategically, things start to get vaguer. So, and in order to sort of make sense of how China behaves, I think it would be useful here to refer to a poignant definition by Julien of China's power that he described as a power that owns but does not act. So instead of pursuing predefined objectives, often Chinese actors, we can think about like Chinese political actors as well as Chinese SOEs, for example, try to adapt and do not pursue necessarily normative or pre-existing objectives, which I think is what like confuses a bit Western actors, especially in Europe, when looking at how China behaves strategically. So these approaches are rooted in a long tradition of Chinese thought, where the focus of strategy does not necessarily rely on shaping and manipulating circumstances, which is normally strategic behavior which is associated with Western approaches. And this was also poignantly described by Henry Kissinger in his book on China in 2021, where he draws a comparison between the game of Go, translated in Wei Qi in Chinese, to the, like comparing this to the strategic thinking as opposed to the Western thinking that he compares to the game of chess. I think an example of this is the Belt and Road Initiative, as Professor Kawashima-Shin has mentioned before. The Belt and Road Initiative is certainly an exemplary case of how China exercises its power beyond its border as a global actor. And often in like Western literature and amongst like Western policymakers, the Belt and Road Initiative is conceptualized as a hegemonic or like expansionist project. However, it is like Chinese actors, the vast array of Chinese actors taking part to this initiative actually strategically act in the way I've just described. So for example, what emerges from the National Development and Reform Commission's 2015 document on the BRI visions and actions is that the BRI lacks completely centralization and lacks a specific set of rules, but instead is highly flexible and does not seek conformity amongst its members. So which makes it harder to understand. So it appears that projects like the BRI endeavor to sort of build a common framework. As Professor Kawashima-Shin mentioned before, it is important to ask ourselves, is it win-win? Like if it is who is winning here? And of course, China is winning. Very rarely, like members of the BRI, of like a BRI initiative win here because of like poor financial sustainability or other sustainability matters. However, we cannot say that the BRI is highly orchestrated or organized. This can be recognized from its unmappability, incoherence, unclear administration. It does not exist to date a sort of like a committee handling the BRI. It does not exist like an official map. All official Chinese maps are inconsistent. So what like emerges is that like the BRI has a strong narrative, and but its like its results, more than being like a traditional like hegemonic project, are actually aimed at creating a space that is opportunistically favorable to China. So how like this like more like China being more powerful in this sense has reflected in its relationship with the European Union, and how are the views on China amongst other European G7 members. So of course this has reflected, I would say, in a shift in the EU's relation with a more powerful China. So recent developments in relations between the EU and China, such as formal visits and the release of new strategic documents, have demonstrated how much European attitudes have shifted during the leadership of Xi Jinping. A key turning point, I believe, is the release of the Strategic Outlook in 2019 by the European Commission, where China was for the first time recognized as a systemic rival, as well as an economic competitor and also a partner in dealing with transnational threats. Then this posture was also reaffirmed with other strategic documents, such as the Strategic Compass for Security and Defense, released in March 2022. And whilst the European Union has confirmed its intention to stick to this sort of tripartite strategy with 3 different dimensions with China, which tries to encapsulate the complexity of dealing with an actor like China, this has resulted in, formally in a certain degree of confusion on the Chinese side, but more realistically has been perceived negatively. Notably, Wang Yi has described the strategy as a cognitive dissonance, and there has been a growing impasse in the relationship being registered. For example, during the China-EU summit in 2022, which Borrell has described as a dialogue of the deaf because of the inability of the two parties to cooperate and discuss constructively. And so with the relationship incorporating this new security dimension, China sort of transitioned from a strategic partner, as stated in the 2003 Comprehensive Strategic Partnership, to a dimension of security concern, as phrased in 2019. And with this growing security dimension in the relationship, in March 2003, in her speech hosted by MEREX and APC, Ursula von der Leyen has also introduced the concept of idea risking, as we are all aware, I guess, in this room, which will be absolutely central in defining the development of the relationship in the next years, and aiming at reducing the EU's economic and strategic dependence on China in critical fields, whilst trying to maintain a more open approach compared to the US, outdating decoupling. And so this pursuit of idea risking approach defines the EU's tripartite strategy to China in a starker way, I believe. So it leaves more space to the sort of systemic rivalry dimension, which I think is signaling that the EU also is shifting more starkly its strategy towards China. And will be implementing and has been implemented through legislation such as the Critical Raw Materials Act, and we can expect more to come in this direction. So the securitization moves by EU institutions have intensified in recent years, notably since 2019, and have reflected in increasing securitization moves also at the nation-state level. And as Matteo was mentioning before, this also emerges on the ideological level. So, the European Union has a strong normative identity, of course, and presents itself as the embodiment of quite specific liberal democratic norms and values. Is also close partners to the United States. So China's increasing economic weight and assertive foreign policy, which is exemplified in projects such as the BRI, especially when entering an exercise into the European Union, can be perceived as a security challenge. However, whilst these concerns and these values matter, obviously, both at the European Union institutional level and at the nation-state level, the way in which they do and the way they are instrumentalized create significant differences. So on a general level, I would say European G7 members all shifted towards a more securitized approach towards China and embraced the de-risking strategy in their relation with China. However, coordination among member states still remain an important issue in this sense, because also China itself prefers to handle its relationships with European member states on a bilateral level. So Chinese actors know that whilst there are common guidelines such as the security toolkit, member states still retain control over their commercial decisions. So they prefer to handle the relationship bilaterally at the nation state level. This has been evident, for example, during the joint visit of French President Macron and von der Leyen in April 2023, where it was clear that the Chinese counterpart was much more interested in handling the discussion at the nation state level with Macron rather than with von der Leyen. But this does not just stem from China's preference for such relationships, but also from a competitive imperative amongst EU members. I think it is crucial to acknowledge here that European member states engage in economic competition among themselves, quite a fierce competition actually, and China stands as a significant commercial partner in this competition. So, and this introduces an extra layer of complexity in terms of like embracing this de-risking approach. In terms of like Russia as a factor here. For EU-China relations, China's position on the conflict in Ukraine is a determining factor, to quote von der Leyen, for the development of EU-China relations. And however, I would like to sort of like build on what Professor Kawashima-Shin was saying before of China not necessarily having to be considered an ally of Russia. I think there is a Chinese proverb that poignantly describes the relationship here. They sleep in one bed but dream of different dreams. And I think it emerges poignantly from Chinese official documents as well as remarks and news as well, that China does not necessarily support Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but rather wants to adopt a neutral, opportunistic stance to use its economic advantage as a leverage to advance its interests. On the other hand, like, there have been remarks by Xi Jinping during his visit in Moscow last March, such as I quote here, "Change is coming that hasn't happened in 100 years, and we are driving this change together." So I think what has to be considered here is that, of course, I think there has been concern on the Chinese side over Putin's rhetoric regarding the potential use of nuclear weapons. It has been condemned. The invasion of Ukraine has been condemned. However, at a broader strategic level, China and Russia underscores what China perceives as an emerging geopolitical landscape, which is characterized by a shift in decision-making structures where non-Western countries such as China play pivotal roles. And this emerges poignantly from Chinese key documents. China sees itself as the leading actor in this change and placing Russia actually at a subordinate role here. So I think this is quite important, like to know the difference with China in the kind of power it is in the strategic thinking it adopts, but to recognize that both China and Russia underscore what China perceives as the new emerging geopolitical landscape. Yeah, and I conclude here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alice. All right, so we have plenty of time for Q&A. I think that we could definitely have half an hour Q&A, but we could even go 10 minutes farther if possible. So I would like to take advantage of my prerogative as chair of this panel to provide just a couple of comments for Professor Kawashima, for Professor Diane, and also like to ask a question to Ms. Politi. And I will start with Professor Kawashima. As a person who was trained during his PhD in Chinese history, I greatly enjoyed your presentation. And I especially enjoyed how you discussed the connection between the current party history, Dangshi, and the role of the party in shaping more broadly historiography in China, and instead the current and now decades-old trend in Western historiography. Of course, you mentioned the New Qing historiography that traces back to the early 90s. More recently, another very problematic text in Western historiography on China is Bill Hayton's The Construction of China. There is another text that moves beyond Qing history to actually emphasizing how what we call China today is just another imagined community that emerged especially with the establishment of the Republic of China. But we could even trace it. First of all, I would say I really enjoyed that you didn't mention the tributary system, considering that this is actually Western construction is a construction of the Harvard School of Sinology and John King Fairbank. And often when we think about China and how the past and history informs China, especially in the West, we fall into the trap of thinking about the tributary system, while the reality, at least from what we understand from documents, is much more complex and even more interesting, I would say. But there is definitely this tension between Western historiography and that incestuous relationship between propaganda work, ideological work, party history and historiography in China that goes even before the Qing history. Of course, I'm thinking about, for example, Ge Zhaoguang famous book, He Wei Zhongguo, What is China, that actually traces back the unity of the Chinese nation to Song Dynasty. And of course, more recently in the news, we think about all the work that China is doing in publicizing Homo erectus pekinensis, the Peking man, as the actual ancestor of the entire Chinese nation, in many ways even genetically separating these Zhongguo Minzu, this Chinese ethnic group, as a unity of various, what in the past were Shoshu Minzu, as a unique experience in human history. And so I greatly appreciated these many historiographical insights that your talk gave us. And on the same line, Matteo, it was very interesting when you mentioned the New Confucian dimension, and my perception is slightly different. I feel that, especially under the Xi Jinping administration, there was a de-emphasization of the New Confucian angle. That was very much, at least I repeat, it's just my perception, but I felt that that was very much a story told during the Hu-Wen administration. And I think that I feel that the emphasis on the Neo-Confucianism has actually been toned down, and maybe just for a matter of further separating the Hu-Wen era from the Xi era. Maybe beyond the Neo-Confucian side, there is a stronger legalist side, Fajia. So there is definitely that dimension there. And actually this goes back to a common pattern in Chinese history. You have a Confucian veneer, but that was easy to explain to the public, while behind the Confucian veneer you actually have a very strong legalist approach. If we really want to go back into try to find how past schools of Chinese thinking inform China. But again, really, this is really my perception. I'll be happy if you disagree with me. And another point I want to make is that I really enjoyed that you talked about ideological oversupply. I think it's a very good point. I wonder if you agree with my impression that this is ultimately a byproduct of the Leninist organization of power in China. A Leninist regime is bound to provide an oversupply of ideology because it's part of the way in which it produces and reproduces power in the country. And finally, for Alice, I really enjoyed, I think you quite clearly says that basically we could understand the BRI as a narrative tool that has been used by China to expand China's strategic space. Am I correct, Alice? Right, and I think it's very interesting. The National Bureau of Research has led the project, Nadège Roland has led the project on the strategic space of China, also historiographically in the past. I was wondering, how do you feel, how and where do you think the BRI has changed more in detail this strategic space of China, either its conceptualization or the axis of this expansion? Thank you very much. So I would like to continue in this order. I would like to listen if there are any comments from the speakers, and then we can move ahead with the questions from the rest of the audience. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Very interesting question. I answered one point about the tribute system, okay, in China. Yes, it is surprisingly, in China, tribute system was recognized, so a peaceful relationship with surrounding country. So China did not use the military power to make other countries to approach to China. This is their image, okay? So under the Hu Jintao period, Hu Jintao advanced the Taoguanyanhui policy. At that time, Hu Jintao period, China thought China could use this tribute system, the concept of tribute system, to combine with Taoguang Yanghui, this policy. And China actually, actually Hu Jintao as Minister itself, actually adopt some concept into the Chopian Waijiao, diplomacy towards a neighborhood country. As you know, China uses some terminology based on the traditional concept of Chinese Chinese classic on the policy towards surrounding country. However, surrounding countries like Islamic countries cannot understand what China says. Okay, so actually Xi Jinping as administration continues using this terminology. However, it's not so efficient to make surrounding country approach to China. Thank you.
One brief comment also on my side, especially on the Neo-Confucian dimension. Perhaps strictly Neo-Confucian belongs more to the Hu Jintao period. However, what I also mean here as Neo-Confucian, for instance, concepts like community of common destiny, so where you have these ideas of verticality, hierarchy, but also with harmony and stability. So broadly Neo-Confucian, I think it is very important because that dimension of verticality and centrality emerges much more under the Xi Jinping era. So in that sense, I would say is very important. And I agree with the good idea on the Leninism that leads to oversupply of ideology is a great point. Thanks.
Yes, in terms of the question on the narrative of the BRI and how the BRI has expanded China's strategic space. So first of all, I think it's important to understand that how the BRI has been advertised internally and externally is really different. So it's a different narrative. And internally, of course, it follows the very strong nationalistic narrative that characterizes the tenure of Xi Jinping. And draws a lot on historical comparisons as well, and sort of the historical legacy of the Silk Road, etc. Even if actually there is no map of the BRI. So I mean, but externally, I mean, it has created I would say mainly a space and a framework where China can advance its commercial and economic interests without the interference of the United States. So basically the Belt and Road Initiative goes everywhere except for the United States. It has gone in the European Union, in the so-called Global South, notably in other countries in Asia. So I would say that has been the main goal and the main sort of result, to build a framework that is very is not very determined, it's not easy to sort of pin down, but that creates a space where China can advance its commercial interests without the interference of the US necessarily. And there is also I would say, a diplomatic and soft power dimension, because the narrative surrounding the initiative is really strong. So advancing commercial and economic interests, but with this soft power dimension. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Alicia. So we could proceed to the Q&A, to the proper Q&A session. We have plenty of questions. Sorry? And one on the back too. Absolutely. So please keep it short, not as I did. I would rather go ahead one by one rather than collecting all the questions, because we have plenty of people. I would like to invite Professor Kenendo first.
Thank you. Thanks for the thanks very much for the stimulating presentation. I just need to ask one question about this China-Russia relations on Ukraine. Now, I know that Kawashima-san has all the time emphasized this sort of Chinese concerns about, that they want to be seen as part of the developing countries and then third world, or if you the global south. But I just wondered, you three had sort of nuanced presentations on this, and how much is that concern? Is that concern decisive, especially if we take into account that China has overriding need to compete strategically with the United States? And for that matter, China needs Russia on board to compete with the United States. So I've got your point, but I just want to know, I want to have this sort of weighing exercise, which is more important. And so one more short question, sorry, to all of you. If we borrow the term of Alice, Europe has had this more securitized stance to China. How do you three analyze the Chinese attitude and reactions to this changed stance? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yes, that's right. It's interesting, but anyway, at present, Xi Jinping's administration, China takes importance of two basic principles, yes, adopted in the 1950s and the 80s. Xi Jinping does not change it. The first is peace and friendship principle, adopted in the 1950s by Zhou Enlai. Next one is the independence and autonomous principle adopted in 1980s. If China change it or adjust the contents, maybe the balance will be changed. If China keeps it, Xi Jinping recognized its leadership toward the developed country is important, more important than relationship with Russia, I think. However, it's possible for China, as I said, China sometimes changes principle. This is a signal, I think. And yes, that's right. European countries changed its policy strategically toward China. The big pressure toward China. So China changed its attitude of the diplomats toward European countries. 5 years ago, the diplomats in Sweden, in Paris, were so aggressive towards European countries. However, China stopped it, basically stopped it. And also, China used the bilateral relations to each country or EU. And also China strengthened, advanced the relationship with the non-EU countries in Europe, Montenegro and others. So China is advancing the diplomacy on the bilateral relations first. Secondly, it is so difficult for China to use the relationship with NATO. It's so difficult for China to push, make something toward NATO. So China wants to penetrate into some gap or some room between EU and NATO. It is China's strategy, but a little bit difficult, I think. Is my answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else wants to answer? Matteo, please.
Yeah, I will perhaps add something on this China-Russia situation. I mean, I would just point out there are a few considerable costs for China associated with Russia's war against Ukraine. I mean, the BRI went through Eastern Europe. That, I mean, was the target of a certain strategy to try to detach Eastern Europe from Western Europe, and especially Eastern Europe from NATO, that was completely ruined by Russia, because now NATO is much more consolidated, coherent, cooperating together to deal with Russia. US alliances in general have been consolidated. Now we have all the discussions of Japan-NATO cooperation and then Japan-South Korea cooperation. Those are all net costs. So there is also that side of the disadvantage when we think about the cooperation between the two. But also on the other side, there is, I mean, if you look at the ideological point, there is convergence, there is strong anti-US stance. China has gained a lot of influence in Russia, establishing a very asymmetric relationship with Russia, so that perhaps is a plus for Beijing. And also, the other thing is that the global south is not that against the war as we think it should be. If you look in Brazil, South Africa, let alone the Middle East, it goes from neutral to, well, we don't oppose it. And so the cost is not that big as we thought it would have been in terms of legitimacy. So getting closer to Russia becomes more feasible, especially if we think about China reaching out to the global south as a sort of central field of competition. So I think we have to consider both sides. And also, the other side is gone. I mean, NATO is much more consolidated. Look at Poland. Poland was entertaining a particular relationship with China and the entire Eastern Europe. That is completely gone because China has sided with Russia, and what they think about is Russia, essentially. But aside from it, it's much more nuanced than perhaps we think.
Thank you, Matteo. Alice?
Yes, I just wanted to say one thing on this question on Russia. I don't think that China is necessarily coming closer in its partnership with Russia. I think it's actually continuing as it has always been. Xi Jinping has been very clear in stating that this is not a conflict that directly affects China. Like he said, this is a European conflict. Even if the consequences of this have directly affected China, because of course Ukraine was a significant commercial partner of China, and this conflict has created global instability and economic global instability in a moment where China, as we all know, is facing significant economic challenges. But of course, like there is, I think the component of like competing strategically with the US does not necessarily go against like not strengthening their partnership with Russia. Like I think China is at the same time trying to compete strategically with the US in its relationship with China, with Russia, but at the same time trying to be portrayed as an actor that complies with the current international order and does not like create additional problems in this sense, and that like collaborates in keeping international security. I mean, whether it's true or untrue, but I think that is the image they're trying to portray. Yeah.
Thank you, Alice. Giulio, you want to go ahead with the second question, or please?
There are people that were beforehand of me, but I'll be quick. I have a question for Kawashima-sensei, really, or for anybody who wants to pick it up. It's a thought experiment. On the extraterritorial overreach of China, how does it compare to India? It's something that we will probably have to also talk about, because there have been cases that didn't, but made the news the past year about the attempts, and successful ones as well, at extraterritorial killing. How does it compare with China? Is China's modus operandi different, or perhaps we should also talk about India having a similar kind of empireness sort of mentality? Should we talk about overseas police stations? You mentioned it at the very end, but I would like you to expand on it, because I would be very, very interested. Italy, I ask this question, has the largest Chinese expat community in Europe, as you know, especially also near Florence and Prato and in northern Italy. So that's also why I'm very curious about this question. And then this is a question for all of the speakers. Fascinating discussions, thank you. What I found as a recurring leitmotif is that there is an emphasis on narratives and legitimization stories that we tell each other to make common sense of how the world works. And it looks to me that this oversupply of narratives is also perhaps a byproduct of action-reaction dynamics, to bring it back to my cynical Italian, or rather skeptic take, where you see the BRI eliciting the free and open Indo-Pacific, the GDI, GSI, GDI feeding off, and the community of common destiny feeding off our narrative over supply on the rules-based order, the international liberal order, techno-autocracies versus techno-democracies. So it looks to me, it looks as if we're also talking past each other with our own little bubbles sometimes. And the very same dynamics you talk, we've talked about when we talk about China, oddly enough, this is a provocation, might apply to us as well. If that's the case, is there a way forward to find perhaps a common ground? Because it looks to me that there are action-reaction dynamics at play where some of these narratives act as counter-narratives to effectively a more contested space. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much. Actually, for a Chinese point of view, India is the most irritating actor as now. Yeah. So after the Global South Summit held in January 2023, China could not criticize India. If China criticized India, China's their own something order or some the image of the axis in the world will be destroyed. So China cannot do it. And also, as you said, India is now adopting some expanding policy toward the Eastern Africa or Indian Ocean and so on. So China also understands it. However, now that China does not have any specific policy to be against India's expansionism now. So it is because China, as I said, China has some basic principles. China is the member of the developing country. India is a good partner, okay, in this group of the developing countries. So if China changes its policy toward India, China must change these important principle. So I think it's so interesting. But anyway, at present, China is just under consideration now, I think. And next topic, yes. As I said, China started using the word of Global South last July, but China put quotation mark to the Global South. That means China has a negative attitude toward these words. FOIP is also free and open Indo-Pacific. China sometimes uses this word but put the quotation mark. However, as you know, AOIP, ASEAN's FOIP, when China uses it, China does not put quotation mark. China accepts it. Okay, I don't know, this is your common ground or not. Okay, but anyway, China accepts the concept of the FOIP by ASEAN. So China is adjusting such an attitude toward these concepts from other advanced countries and others. Thank you, Ismail.
Thank you very much, Professor Kawashima. May we go ahead with the questions to give an opportunity to everyone, please. Takenaka-sensei, please.
Okay, I have one question to Kawashima Sensei and one question to Matteo. The question is on I thought your story about how the Chinese are trying to reinterpret the history of Qin dynasty was very interesting. But are they trying to give legitimacy to their expansionist attitude? If that is the case, are they going to go far down to the south to cover Malaysia? That's my. And for Matteo-san, about these changing attitudes of the European countries towards China. Of course, I think the Europeans came to be more concerned about security threats or economic coercion posed by China. But has the economic interest of respective countries vis-a-vis China, the weight of economic interest of various European countries, were there changes in the relative economic interest of European countries vis-a-vis China? For example, like Germans, they were very much exporting a bunch of cars to China, but now they are losing their competitiveness because of because the Chinese car manufacturers are getting more competitive. Are those kind of changes? Have these kind of changes had any impact on relationship between European countries and China? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Very interesting question. But I did not say on your point that my presentation, because Chinese government also does not say it. Okay. Yeah. So, if Qing Dynasty, the period of Qing Dynasty is the period of the formation of China, yeah, the border was different from the border after the Xinhai Revolution. So everybody can imagine there are gaps between the borders as Qing Dynasty and the border at present. Okay. So it's so easy for all of Chinese to imagine it, but China does not say it at this point. Okay, this is my answer.
Matteo, please.
And very, very briefly, no, I think the economic interests are still there. Many of our countries import and export to China, so there will be relevant stakeholders that they would complain about the fact that there's a more securitized approach. On the other side, though, I think we are realizing that certain elements are problematic and they enable coercion, and when this coercion is exercised, it is a risk for our countries, and therefore we are engaging in a very delicate balance, in a balance that is very political and very complicated in the process of understanding what the risking is and how to carry out a policy of the risking. So I think, yeah, it will be evolving in the next years. It will be back and forth in every different countries, but the economic interests in engagement are still there. And at the end of the day, it might be also a good thing that enables to maintain this idea of coexisting with competition, but maintaining the coexisting part in place is also important for the sake of everyone's stability and peace, I would say.
Thank you, Matteo. I would like to speed up a little bit the process. So, Roger and Enrico, can I collect both your questions? Roger first and Enrico after.
Thank you, Aurelio. Two brief questions that I'd like the panel to reflect on. The first question is, we are talking about China, particularly in relation to Taiwan, but more broadly in its region, as though it is already given that it is an aggressor. I just looked up Chinese military spending, and if it were a NATO member, the United States would essentially be very angry with it for not meeting its 2% of GDP threshold. In fact, China spends about the same in GDP percentage terms on its military as this other great military power, Italy. To what extent are we perhaps overestimating the extent to which China intends to add military muscle? And obviously I'm aware of the fact that China is a large country, so even 1.7% of GDP in the Chinese case ends up being a fairly significant amount of cash. But nevertheless, it does not seem to me that this is a country that is significantly gearing up towards a war economy, and so are we not overestimating the Chinese military threat, and if so, are we not perhaps inviting the crisis that we choose to avoid? And the second reflection that I would like to ask is, we seem to be taking the liberal international order as a default position. Unfortunately, I'm sad to say that I personally believe that the liberal international order is a historical anomaly, which was only possible during a highly exceptional period of history, although it is that period of history that most, if not all of us, have spent our formative years in. As Neil Ferguson, with whom I agree on nearly nothing, but I agree with him on this, has said, the liberal order is neither liberal nor international, nor indeed very orderly. To what extent, therefore, are we flattering ourselves by taking the liberal international order as a default in which we can only come out smelling of roses? And must we actually look at this from the perspective of a post-Cold War paradigm, which should be far more historically situated, and in fact, in which we could be a little bit more self-critical, particularly in terms of how we created an economic order to essentially become a lot wealthier, and we are now turning against that very economic order as we figure out that China might benefit from it as well.
Thank you very much, Roger. Enrico, would you like to also add your question?
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, I had several questions, but I think I'm going to just shrink. To Kawashima-sensei, my question is, given that China's current economic difficulties or crisis resemble, or has, according to some economists, many features in common with the experience that Japan have been gone through in the previous decades. So, how Japan perceive, or you perceive, the current economic situation in China? Is it going to affect China's rise? Do you perceive this as a beginning of a decline or a correction of China's regional and global role? That's my first question. And second, which is connected, how does Japan perceive the potential impact of implementation of Macron declaration over Ukraine, namely NATO intervention in Ukraine, which kind of impact this may have over Taiwan? Is there a Japanese or your personal perspective on this, whether potential intervention, NATO intervention in Ukraine may affect the outlook that Japan has over the Taiwan Strait? And my last question is my personal curiosity, which is connected to your presentation about the apparent overlapping between China's definition of the global South and the current assessment of Chinese main contradiction, so developed countries versus non-developed countries. Can you tell me more about it, because this is something that is personally interesting for me at a research level. Thank you so much.
Kawashima, and then maybe everyone who wants to answer to Roger. Dr. Wu, would you also answer to Roger's question? Yes.
Because now it's Taiwan on the agenda. So I have a similar question for Kawashima-sensei.
Maybe we could go first with Roger's and Enrico's questions, and then I will let you immediately.
Because it's a similar question. I just want because you mentioned that Shingaku Island and the Kinmen Island. I think the scenario is more or less similar. Do we see any similarity or dissimilarity, and what can be learned from the past experience and the current situation, given Chinese attitudes in changing the status quo? And the second question I want to ask is again, when there's a Taiwan contingency, what would be, and it also the question is also addressed to Ambassador, what would be the legal basis for Japan domestically to intervene, and for international community, especially European Union, to intervene if there's a Taiwan contingency?
Kawashima-sensei, sorry, can you please be very concise?
Yeah, but some of questions would be, I think it should be answered by Ambassador Ishii, I think. I think.
During the coffee break also.
Yes, first of all, your question about the economy. Actually, in Japan, the specialist of macroeconomy of China were so pessimistic about Chinese economy. It's similar to Japan. However, specialists with Chinese microeconomy, they are not pessimistic, because there are so many good and active companies in China to advance the innovation and others. There are so much diversities in Chinese economic society, they say, and they point out this situation is different from Japanese situation in 1990s. Japanese commodity is so strong, but everybody was just decreasing so much. However, in China, there are some diversities. It's so interesting. China is a socialistic country, but the Chinese has social diversity. So some companies advance innovation, something in Shenzhen and Zhejiang and others. So specialists of Chinese microeconomy, they are not pessimistic. As they point out, Chinese situation is different from Japanese situation in 1990s. This is my answer. And about the, yes, second point is about some contradiction of the Chinese concepts. That's right. So, for example, yes, first is so-called their own definition. China is a developing country. Is China a developed country? Really? It's a big point. And also, China is originally a member of the Global South. So, most of the developing countries recognize China is the original member of the developing country. It's also the big point, big problem for China. So, as Anderson said, India's existence of India is also. So, just some a series of contradictions of the Chinese original interpretation about the world order and that something. So we have to pay attention to the Chinese maybe new concept or adjustment of the concepts of foreign policies in the near future, I think, under the Xi Jinping administration, third or fourth Xi Jinping administration, I think. This is my answer. The other question to be answered by him.
Thank you, Kawashima-sensei. Matteo, would you like to?
Yeah, I can take the comment on China as an aggressor. Well, on point of military expenditures on GDP, perhaps, but the rhetoric, the hybrid strategies, the coercive strategies, the exercises, the declarations, the conduct in the South China Sea, the violation of the status quo, the 9-dash line, are all good signs that make sense to perceive China as the aggressor in the area, even without taking a particularly sophisticated position on Taiwan and taking sides on Taiwan. But the actions and the policies and the rhetorics, I think they are there. The other point on the liberal international order, and then of course we go into sort of political philosophical preferences, but also on stances or on macro elements in the international order. Perhaps it's an historical anomaly, but perhaps it's also better than any other alternatives that we can think of in terms of stability, openness, a certain degree of adherence to values compared to the alternatives. If the alternative is competition between great powers with not many boundaries, if the alternative is breaking down of economic interdependence, if the alternative is breaking down of international cooperation, then I'm entirely fine with the liberal international order.
So am I, but we need to be critical about it.
Oh yeah, we can be critical. No, absolutely. I mean, we can, and we can also say sometimes we are hypocritical about it, and we exaggerate the liberal feature of the liberal international order. Perhaps it should be more liberal than less. But yeah, of course, it will be a long debate. But exactly, for coffee.
Alice, please.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank Roger for these questions. Really grateful you asked this. On whether we're overestimating Chinese military threat. So I wouldn't say we're overestimated, but I would say there are two elements that are important to keep into consideration. The first one is that China currently does not have the military capacity and sophistication for an amphibious attack to Taiwan. So I say, of course, as Matteo mentioned, like there is no a lot of space for like overestimation, but it's important to keep this into consideration. Right now, currently, there is no capability or sophistication for such an attack. And the second element, I think, is the current, is to consider the current economic challenges that China is facing. Quite frankly, I think that China is on the verge of very dark times, economically speaking, if this tenure of Xi Jinping doesn't really adjust some things in some aspects in that direction. So yeah, I would say like this element is important to be kept into consideration when thinking of a potential attack. I don't think, together with not having capacity, military and like military sophistication, also doesn't have the economic possibility to do it at the moment. And on the question on the liberal international order, I completely agree on the fact that we have to be critical about it, and that it cannot be taken as a default sort of framework. I think it comes natural sometimes to like consider it as a default nature, because of course we are sort of part of it. Here, like in Italy, in Europe, I think it's really important to detach from that, especially when thinking of how a country like China may strategically think, because that completely differs. And I think a lot of like the narrative and that Xi Jinping has pushed for, with China now being a rule maker and not a rule taker anymore, also does fall into that like misconception that we may have sometimes. Yeah.
Thank you for calling us out, Roger. Thank you. Yes, we have two last questions, very briefly. Dr. Nagy first, and then there's a question.
Thank you. I don't know if I can be brief, but I want to kind of link some questions. And Alice really mentioned, or your comments made me think of Kent Calder's descriptions of Japan in terms of a reactive and a proactive state. And the way you depicted China is a rather reactive state. It reacts to different kind of events and then positions opportunity. And here I'm thinking COVID-19, I'm thinking Russian invasion, I'm even thinking what's happening in Gaza today, how it's positioned itself to maximize its national interests. So I'd like to kind of drill into that and hear your views on that. And this links to your comments, Matteo, about the kind of the fundamental pillars of Chinese foreign policy in terms of Marxist-Leninism, post-colonial nationalism, and Neo-Confucianism. You know, I guess I've read too much of Kevin Rudd's book and The Avoidable War, and I think his arguments about China leaning or tilting to the right and to the left at the same time are very, very significant, and that the framework for Chinese foreign policy and society moving forward is firmly built on a Leninist platform of control, and everything else is plus alpha. So right now, we're moving towards some kind of a community of common destiny, reducing the gap between rich and poor, and this is the new steps of crossing the river and feeling through the feelings of stones. They don't know what comes next because things are so difficult, and this leads to Alice's comment, right? We're moving into dark times, and what is the best way to move forward? So I'm trying to link your questions, so I wonder if you can touch upon that. And then lastly, Professor Karashima, you know, I was really interested in some writing that came out by the director of the Center for Russia and Central Asian Studies, Professor Fu Yun Jun and Wei Long Jie, and they were very critical of China's position on Russia. And I sent the essays to Giulio, so maybe he can send it to everybody. But I was struck by somebody who's in such a position, Deputy Director of Fudan University, could write such critical views about Russia publicly. What does this suggest about positioning of China on Russia? And I'm not sure if you've read the papers, but Julia, please distribute to everybody. Because if these damning critiques of Putism and Russia are correct, and if this person is at such a position, what does this say about China's position on Russia? Is this a message to Putin, or is this a message and fishing to the United States that we can shift our position on Russia if you shift your position on us? Thank you for a great, great session.
Thank you, Stephen. I would like to collect also the question from the audience, and so if please the speaker could introduce himself too, please. And you could please use my microphone.
Thank you very much indeed. My name is Michael Sanfi. I'm at Robert Schuman Center. I just have a very short question for Professor Dian. When he was talking about differences between G7 countries, he said that EU members tend to underplay ideological differences. I think that's a very interesting insight, and I just wonder, why does Professor Dian think that they do that? Thank you.
So can we proceed first with Stephen's question, please?
Yes, of course. Thank you very much for your questions. And yeah, I completely espouse the definition seeing China as a reactive power rather than a necessarily active power. This is what I meant with the like Julien's expression, a power that owns but does not act. I mean, it does act in the end, but not in the same way like Western strategic thinking is used to assume. And I would say that. Yeah, I would definitely say China is a reactive power and also an opportunistic power. I think I've noticed this a lot studying case studies of like Belt and Road Initiative projects. Like it often comes up that like things are much vaguer than what we think, with a very varied and diversified array of factors taking part to that. And the common denominator here is like trying to find like opportunistic situations and carve those situations quite indirectly and in a reactive way. But I think this also applies to like the way like Chinese actors and Chinese leadership behaves in other situations as well. I'm thinking of its relationship with Russia here. Like I think that sort of applies as well. If we think about like Xi's visit to Moscow last year, a large part of the visit concentrated actually on advancing interests on like Chinese, seeking support for a Chinese presence in the Arctic. So like talks on Ukraine were not as extensive as like talks on like leveraging economic power to advance these kind of interests. So I would definitely say is reactive and is opportunistic. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Alice. Matteo, please.
Yeah, I would agree on Steven's comment 100%. So I will not add much more than that. I agree on that mix and moving on the left and the right at the same time, the centrality of Leninism and the centrality especially of maintaining control that are very important. On the other question on why the European side of the G7 underlines less the ideological difference. Somehow because we underline much more the aspect of economic interdependence and up to a few years ago seeing China mostly as an opportunity. If you go back to see how Italy got into the Belt and Road, for instance, and how we signed up to things like win-win cooperation without really getting what win-win was, probably at the time, or mutual respect of sovereignty. That was in that document and so on and so forth. But also because Japan has started really quite some time ago. If you go back to the confluence of the two seas, so we go back to 2007, Abe Shinzo speaking in India. So that idea of building an international order based on a commonality of strategic interest plus values dates back almost a decade and a half now, almost 2 decades. And so really we woke up much later in that sense.
Thank you very much, Matteo. I'm already running 8 minutes late, so I will conclude here this fantastic first public session. Thank you very much.
And I'm very sorry to actually behave like the bad cop to Aurelio's good cop. We need to really make sure that we don't go ahead of schedule. So we aim for 11:40 start. We also have Alison waiting, in the virtual room to do her presentation. So 11:40, and I'm sure that it will end up at 11:43 or something. But aim for 7 minutes of a break. Restrooms are on the right. There is coffee. There is refreshment. Your cakes and sugar intake will be afforded on the separate room. Yes.